Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andris Sprūds. I'm a director of the Institute of International Affairs, and I am very happy to invite and to welcome everybody here, of course, in this afternoon in our seminar, in our discussion seminar on Russia. But I guess it's not just about Russia. It's about the security and stability in the region and, to some extent, what kind of world we live in. And this is an event which is co-organized by Latvian Institute of International Affairs, but with support and with active participation of European Leadership Network and Nuclear Threat Initiative. And we've been happy also, of course, to cooperate with other international partners. We had a very good day of discussions today. And, of course, now we also been willing to engage with the public, the informed people also of Latvia, so that we have also exchange of ideas and opinions and thought in a wider perspective, in a wider audience. Today the seminar, of course, is on Western Russia charting unknown waters. 2014, and 2014 must have been a year of success in many regards. It's a 10th anniversary of EU and NATO membership, and of course, also as our guests recognized, admitted that Latvia has made really the huge steps forward in the recent years, and also the EU and NATO membership has certainly contributed to this. We have also the year of more active or potentially more active cooperation with Eastern partners. We are in a year which is just half year or 1 year before our EU presidency. And next year, of course, we will have an Eastern Partnership Summit as well in May in 2015. Actually, also the recently relations with Russia, they have been improved, especially in terms of economic engagement, in trade engagement. Trade has increased. Cooperative efforts also in other sectors. Already we've been mentioning the NDN, the Northern Distribution Network, and transportation and transit. So 2014 was supposed to be a good year. Instead of celebrating, we speak of something else. We speak of geopolitical concerns, geopolitical challenges. We speak in Latvia of Russia's aggression. We speak of crossing red lines. We speak of instability in Europe and also actually here in the region as well. And what's the future of the Baltic countries to some extent in all of this regard, and some ideas or thoughts of discussion. How many days Latvian army is supposed to resist? 3 or 4 days also shows to some extent dramatism of this. I would not like to over-dramatize the whole situation, but still, of course, shows the seriousness and importance of the moment and emotionless of the whole moment as well. So what kind of world we live in? What is the potential for the escalation of the conflict? What is the place for the Baltics and Latvia? What are the motives of Mr. Putin? Who is Mr. Putin? We ask this question again to some extent. So what's next? Is it about Soviet Union, or is it about just Crimea? So is it about economic concerns and difficulties in Russia? It's about domestic audiences or foreign policy grand agenda? What is it? So we have here an excellent panel, international panel of very distinguished speakers, and I am happy to introduce, first of all, Kearns, who is co-founder and director of European Leadership Network. Then Sergey Utkin, who is the head of Department of Strategic Assessment, Center for Situation Analysis from Russia. Then we have, so widely, you can say, distributed the panel representation, geographic representation here. Sławomir Dębski, who is director at the Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue and Understanding. And last but not least, Charap, Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia and International Institute for Strategic Studies from the U.S. And you've been also for some time with State Department, as I understand, and so you have also the insights from within how the U.S. establishment also thinks at the moment. So I stop here my introductory remarks, and I'm giving the floor to Ian. And Ian, you've been advocating for years engagement with Russia, or necessity to engage with Russia on many fronts. Is it engagement time over, or we can still hope that engagement is ahead of us? Please.
I don't think. Thank you, first of all, for hosting this event and for the wider conference. It's a real pleasure to be here and to work with you and your colleagues in the Latvian Institute of International Affairs and with colleagues from Nuclear Threat Initiative. I don't think the period of engagement is over, but let me answer your question, if I may, by posing 3 or 4 that I would like to address. First, what is Putin doing? And second, why is he doing it? Third, what core interests of ours are at stake in this crisis? And then fourthly, what should we do to manage it? In terms of what's Putin doing, I think to some extent there's a reactive element to what Putin is doing. I think he's using all of the power instruments available to him to ensure that what he sees as the Russian near abroad doesn't become hostile to Russian interests. And I think he's willing to incur significant costs, and he's demonstrating that he's willing to incur significant costs to do that. However, as I think we all know, he's not just being reactive. There's a very strong proactive element to what he's doing. He has, I think, made it clear in recent weeks that Russia is now a revisionist power. All of this rhetoric about Novorossiya and wherever there are Russians, there is Russia. This is deeply destabilizing to the European security order. And so there does appear to be a proactive element to what he's doing. Why is he doing what he's doing? I would say very quickly 4 reasons. Firstly, I think he's trying to shore up his domestic legitimacy in the face of a stagnating economy. Second, though, I think he's tapping into an already existing deep sentiment in Russia about the fact that Russia sees itself as being disrespected, and he's tapping into a sentiment of Russians wanting to feel proud of their country again. And I think that's something we have to recognize and wrestle with. I think he is responding to some notion of what he sees as Western hypocrisy in terms of Western behavior on the international stage, and what he, in his own terms, views as encirclement. And fourthly, I think he's doing what he's doing because he believes the West will not mount a serious and concerted response to what he's doing. In other words, he's doing it because he also thinks he can get away with it. Now, which core interests of ours are at stake? Which core interests of ours is he challenging? I think we have to be very clear about this in calibrating our response to this crisis. And I don't think we are particularly clear. For me, the core interests at stake here are, first, his challenge to the Helsinki norms, to democracy, human rights, territorial integrity and sovereignty. Second, he's a very clear challenge, I think, to our energy security in the European Union and in the West, certainly in the west of Europe. And thirdly, I think he's a challenge to NATO, potentially a challenge to NATO territory, not necessarily through direct military intervention, but through attempts at destabilization and potentially some form of intervention. Now, that being the case, what can we do to defend these interests and to alter Putin's calculus? My answer to this question comes in 3 parts. I think we have to pursue targeted resistance to what he's doing on the one hand. I think we have to, secondly, pursue calculated compromise with Russia. And thirdly, I think we need a renewed focus on crisis management techniques. In relation to the first of this, targeted resistance, I think we can challenge Putin's narrative that the West is incapable of mounting a serious and cohesive response. And we can increase the costs to him economically of pursuing the course that he's currently pursuing. And in fact, we can make those costs the biggest threat to the legitimacy of his regime. We can make his current course the biggest threat to the legitimacy of his regime by escalating his costs. How can we do all that in practice? I personally think that a wider range of sanctions may well be justified. Secondly, I think we need to look at increasing economic support to Ukraine and to the other Eastern Partnership countries. Thirdly, I'm a strong believer in some of the forward deployment decisions about NATO military capability. I think we need to see more of that. There's been much talk in international affairs in recent years about red lines and the fact that, they didn't exist over Syria and so on. I think ambiguity is a friend only to miscalculation in this kind of crisis, and that Putin needs to understand where the red line is. The red line is NATO territory, and we should be absolutely crystal clear about that. I think if Russia intervenes in eastern Ukraine, we should offer military equipment, intelligence and logistics support to Ukraine. And I think we need to take serious measures to get our reliance on Russian gas reduced in the European Union. I think that is a very, very challenging agenda for us, but I think it's one that it's achievable and we should work at it. But I don't think, as I said at the outset, that the time for engagement is over, and I don't think those measures amount to a full strategy for dealing with this crisis. The second element of what I said was calculated compromise. I believe we need to pursue some kind of accommodation with Russia, and I guess potentially in this audience that may be a more controversial thing to say. I don't believe our goal of policy can be to defeat Putin. I think if we try to do that, if we try to defeat him and humiliate him, it will lead us into a very, very dangerous crisis. I do not believe he is a leader who will go quietly or take defeat lightly, and forcing him into that position, I think, would be extremely dangerous for all of us. I think the goal of our policy has to bring him to the negotiating table on terms that are acceptable, and in doing so avoid a military confrontation with him. And we have to find a way of applying enough pressure to get him to the negotiating table without that becoming a military confrontation. The reason I think we have to do that is not just the obvious one that we don't want a war. I think it's also there's an uncomfortable truth for us here in the West, which is that I think our response will not be sufficient to stop him entirely anyway. I'm not convinced that we can mount, despite all of the measures I just listed, I don't think they're capable of stopping him entirely. I think Russia is not the most powerful country in the world, but it is powerful enough to be a persistent nuisance in this neighbourhood and to see off and live through some of the measures which I've described, at least in the short term. In the long term, I think they have the potential to bring him to the table. But I also think this confrontation is just extremely bad for some of the participants. I think this division, this notion of a geopolitical confrontation between the West and Russia is extremely damaging for and to Ukraine. I think it's deeply damaging to countries like Armenia, which I think, frankly, would like to be closer to the West, but also recognise the reality that they live next to Russia, and ultimately know that if they try to make a choice one way or the other, it could result in some very significant damage to their country. Also, I think countries like Turkey are in quite an interesting position here, economically and in terms of energy, very close to Russia, but also being members of NATO. I think we need to avoid this. A lot of countries, I think, will get damaged by this confrontation, and we need to avoid it. I also would say that I don't think Ukraine should see NATO membership as the answer to this situation. I think Ukraine, as with all other countries in the neighbourhood, has a perfect right to pursue and request NATO membership. Personally, as an analyst looking at what's going on inside NATO and inside the European Union, I don't believe that Ukraine will be offered NATO membership, and I think it would be unwise, personally, for the Ukrainian leadership to make it a fundamental element of what of their way out of the crisis. As I say, I recognise their right to ask for it, and I recognise the right of the Ukrainian people to vote for it and to work towards it. I just don't believe that other NATO members are ready to give that enlargement, and so I don't think it should be central to the solution. I also think much wider cooperation with Russia is still essential on things like WMD proliferation, still on strategic stability in terms of nuclear weapons and so on. Important cooperation on Afghanistan. The transit arrangements in relation to Afghanistan are still functioning. And I would remind everybody, I mean, there's lots of people and lots of knowledge in this room, of course, aware of this, but, history tells us that even when the relationship has been very bad, we've still managed to do important business with the Soviet Union and with Russia. And, just think to the SALT treaty negotiations beginning just a few months after the Prague Spring was crushed. I think there's a history of trying to do important things even when we're in the midst of a confrontation, and I think we should not lose sight of that. I also think that over the last 2 decades, we have failed somehow. I said earlier that Putin was tapping into a deep-rooted sentiment in Russian society. And I think over the last 2 decades, our policy has failed to engage Russia, engage Russian society, and integrate it effectively with the West. I don't say that's only a Western responsibility. Of course, that's been the responsibility of many in Russia. But I think we failed collectively to bring Russia into the Western family of institutions and to make it what you might call a mainstream European country. And I think we need to go back to that goal and keep it in mind, because although I know there's a lot of skepticism in this region about working with Russia, just in the last few days I've heard several people from this region and all from other countries like Georgia make offhand remarks about, of course, it would be brilliant and wonderful if we could have a much better relationship with Russia. And I think that's what we all need to keep working for. It might be a long-term goal, but I think everybody believes that if we could get there, and it will require significant change in Russia, I know, but if we could get there, that would be in everybody's interests. Now, while we're pursuing, and I'll stop in just one moment, while we're pursuing targeted resistance on the one hand and calculated compromise on the other, I think we need a renewed focus, thirdly, on crisis management. These events in recent days of a Russian military aircraft buzzing 12 times past the USS Donald Cook in the Black Sea, and the events in recent days in Slavyansk with the people effectively being taken hostage, these signal to me the potential for all of the relevant players in this crisis to lose control of events. And it's one of the key features of crisis management literature, a focus on maintaining control of events. Now, I don't know what's been going on in Slavyansk. I don't know whether Moscow was pulling strings in Slavyansk and they decided to take to instruct somebody to take some human shields to make life difficult for the Ukrainian security services there, or if a bunch of local people just decided to do whatever they wanted to do. I don't know if the pilot of the aircraft near the Donald Cook was just a freelancer or whether it had instructions to go and do something. What I do know is there's a lot of moving parts here. And it's possible for people to make miscalculations, to make mistakes, and for us to lose control of events. And I think, therefore, there's a whole dimension here of needing to try and maintain some military-to-military communication, maintaining channels of communication open so they can be ongoing dialogue. And importantly, I think all parties in this situation need a strong emphasis on restraint of their own militaries, restraint of third-party actors that could trigger a new phase of the crisis. I think we need to make sure that we're switched on to that danger, and if we do that, we've got a chance, I think, of surviving the short-term pressures of this, while our longer-term policy can potentially bring some fruits.
Thank you, Ivan. I think a very interesting and insightful presentation. I immediately have a follow-up question. It seems that it's like a mission impossible, because on the one hand, we would like to apply pressure but avoid conflict. It seems Russia apparently wants also to apply pressure, but actually is not afraid of conflict. And that's a little bit of clash of paradigms in a sense. And coming back to Western reactions, I think very important aspect is not to lose the face and not to lose the credibility. So we need to be credible in what we do. And because, as you said yourself, it seems that Putin knows that he can get away with this. And we should make sure that he doesn't know that we can get away with this. Yeah. And my question is, what the European Union and the United States is doing right now, is it enough? Would you say that it is the good strategy, or it's absolutely?
I think at the moment we're demonstrating that Putin understands the West more than the West understands itself. The speed of sanctions introduction is completely glacial. And is not going to result in anything significant happening, I think, in a change of Russian policy for a very long time. But the reason for that is that we don't agree on the way forward in the West, inside the European Union or inside NATO. And that's why I'm always suspicious when I see foreign ministers flying to Kiev and other places as though that's where the solution is going to be. Of course, we need to be there and we need to give them support, but we've got a lot of hard work to do ourselves within our own alliance structures and associations if we're going to get a strong policy on this. But I would come back to you on just two quick things. Firstly, I think applying pressure and avoiding conflict, I mean, that is the art, it seems to me, of coercive diplomacy, and we need to engage in some coercive diplomacy here. And secondly, I don't think Russia is unafraid of conflict. I think Putin thinks he can do what he's doing and avoid a conflict because we won't confront him. That's why I think we have to have resistance to his policy in the measures that I outlined, but I do think that resistance has to be targeted, and we can't allow it to become the totality of that. I mean, that itself is not the strategy. And for me, we have to keep in mind the goal. The policy goal is not to defeat him or to humiliate him. The policy goal is to bring him to the negotiating table, terms that are acceptable, and to do that whilst avoiding a conflict.
Excellent, thank you. I think that we will go through and then we come back, and Karina immediately sort of identifies that you are one of the first on the questions list. Sergey, what is the grand strategy of Mr. Putin?
The honest answer, I don't know. And if someone thinks that me leaving just half an hour of metro commute from the Kremlin gives me an ability to read the Kremlin better than most of the analysts in the West do, this is not the case. I ask many questions about the current Russian official policies to myself, and I find not that many answers, but at least we should try to propose some solutions to formulate the solutions that may or may not be taken by the Kremlin. You never know what can happen to be in the head of those few people who take the decisions on the issue, but you have to at least keep an eye on the exits from the crisis situation where we are all in. And in this sense, I find it very interesting that the title of the conference of our public event has this unknown waters formula. And on the one hand, yes. On the one hand, these waters may be unknown, and actually history never repeats itself completely. There is always something new happening. On the other hand, we did come through a number of periods of confrontation, including a very hard period in the beginning of 1980s, a very hard period in the beginning of 1960s, where the real threat of an open nuclear conflict existed, and comparing with these eras that we successfully passed, the crisis that we have today is still a limited one, a regional one. So let's not exaggerate what we see. And actually, even if people think that Putin's policies are detrimental, they still have to answer the question, detrimental to whom? I think they are mostly detrimental for Russia. The West will survive. The West will come out of this crisis, and most of the damage that might happen out of this is the damage for Russia, and we will have to deal with this. We have a lot of saber rattling around this crisis. We have a wide-scale information war. And what is important for experts, for people who still want to have a decent discussion on those issues, is not to become a part of this war. Check the information from the news agencies, especially from the Russian news agencies, but not only. You have all sorts of rumors going around. You have all sorts of people who want to deliver the information and be the first to deliver the information, and that means they have not enough time to prove what they actually try to deliver. That means we all have to be very careful about what we know on what is happening on the ground in Ukraine, what is happening in Russian decision-making, and what could be the consequences of all that. One of the immediate consequences that we face today is the sanctions. So far, these are the personal sanctions against some Russian officials, and also some sanctions against a number of Russian companies linked to the Russian officials. I don't think that the policy of sanctions will change the decision-making in the Kremlin. You may still pursue this course just as a reflection of your irritation with the Kremlin's policies. You may think that you are just obliged to show that you are unable to communicate with a number of people who are included in the decision-making system in Russia, but don't go the self-deceiving way of thinking that these sanctions will really change the way Russia takes decisions. It may make life in Russia harder. It may pose some practical problems to the Russians. But actually, if you follow the thinking of Putin, you may often find that he's, as a judo fighter, as someone who dealt with the Oriental way of fighting, he likes to use the force of his opponent against his opponent. And this might be the case with the sanctions. He might use them to explain why we don't have the modernization in Russia, why we don't have the economic growth, why all of the people have to consolidate around the governmental position, and there is no room for decent voices. So this is the danger that may come out of sanctions, but I do understand that we likely will see more of these sanctions coming. What's the prospect for this crisis to develop in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term? In the short term, we have the upcoming elections, presidential elections of the 25th of May in Ukraine. And as many of you may know, Russia seems to be unwilling to recognize these elections. If you quote Putin directly, you will see that the position is sort of more balanced. He still says that if the elections are free and fair and all the rules are respected, we may recognize them. But this is certainly not enough to help the stabilization process in Ukraine. And this is most probably done on purpose. Then, what can happen if we have these elections and part of Ukrainian regions do not participate in these elections? We may have a de facto split of the country, even without, all those apocalyptic scenarios that are being speculated in the press, without open presence of Russian forces. You will have a part of the country that will not recognize the power which is recognized by the rest of the country. This is where we are all heading today. And we should find ways to at least mitigate the consequences of this short-term upcoming catastrophe. This could be an agreement between the central government of Ukraine with the regions and an agreement that could be supported by presidential candidates, the main presidential candidates at least, the agreement on how they see the major aspects of the upcoming constitutional reform. This could probably be the way. I cannot promise you that the Russian government will support this kind of solution, but the solution is on the table. At least we should discuss it seriously, and first and foremost, it should be discussed among the people in Ukraine. If the major political forces in Ukraine, if the major businessmen in Ukraine, and we know that businessmen in Ukraine have quite some influence, support some sort of solution that includes both the central government and the region and the regions. I don't think that it will be possible for any outside player, including Russia, to do something subversive against this deal that would be growing outside of the Ukrainian community, Ukrainian society. In the middle term, we will have a question on how to change the Ukrainian constitution, how to ensure the balance of central and regional powers in Ukraine. And again, what's the most important thing to my mind is to leave this to Ukrainians, to ensure that they are the one who decide on this issue. And as we don't have much time, I will come to the long term. You may have this crisis for quite some time. It will not end soon. It will develop gradually, coming through different phases. And you may have an impression that it is a crisis forever. It's a crisis that is a point of no return. But still, you have to keep in mind that eventually, as political regimes change, as situation in various countries change, we are all interested in keeping Europe whole and free and without dividing lines. That's what we must try to work on. If it's not possible to work on that on the official level, with the official representatives of Russia, for example, you still may find other ways to work with the Russian society, with the Russian business, to keep the communication going. Because if you isolate Russia completely as a society, as a country, we may end up with a situation which is much, much worse when the dividing line that may appear out of that will really be for a long time and maybe forever, although never say forever probably in politics. So we are in a difficult situation, but there are still ways to get out of it if we are really willing to use them. And when I say we, I also understand that much of responsibility lies with the Russian government to be flexible enough to be able to take these solutions and implement them.
Thank you, Sergey. Thank you for having the Russian contribution to our panel, our discussion. I think it's very important to keep the doors open and exactly to engage in a dialogue. And I asked you about grand strategy, but still I would like to repeat, even though I think you partly answered, and that's why I would kindly ask you to be short, even though I think it's difficult to be. What's the magic formula for grand bargain? Is it possible at all? Is it possible to have some mutually acceptable agreement when both sides have to some extent entrapped themselves in their policies, entrapped themselves in a risk of losing this face and credibility? So how to exit it? Because it seems that there are different visions what should be done, for instance, with Ukraine. And is it easy now? Of course, it's not easy at all, but is it possible at all to get out of, let us say, this entrapment in Ukraine and not to lose the face at the same time?
The key to this, I think, is to be flexible enough in terms of changing your position, because...
is Putin flexible enough? Sorry that immediately, but...
I think he's not. So far, he's not. But, I mean, you know, take the Crimea issue. If this is a conditio sine qua non for the West, that Russian position on Crimea should change, and only then we can discuss the rest of the issues that can lead to a deal between Russia and the West, then I think we will go nowhere, because Putin will not change his position on Crimea. This is just obvious, and you will not find any kind of tools to make him change this position on Crimea. But when it comes to resolution of the conflict in Ukraine, I think options are still on the table. When it comes to the way the international system develops in Europe, I think options are still on the table also for the Russian side. And we have seen how the OC mechanisms have found the new life in the course of this conflict. They may be reformed, they may be refurbished and reinvigorated. I think under the certain conditions you may also find the support for this on the Russian side. This will not be easy. It will not be easy to elaborate a model that will be in everybody's interests. But eventually, if you have Russian economy developing further, in spite of all the obstacles, including political obstacles that we have, there will be a great asset for Russia, not necessarily for the regime, but for Russia, to be part of an open European economic space, not to be, encircled by various economic zones where Russia doesn't take part. It's important for Russia as a country to be involved. And I hope at some point, if we are able to overcome this acute crisis, we will have reasonable politicians in Russia who will support this kind of development and will push for it also inside the Russian government. Although today you can hardly single out those people in this crisis situation.
Okay, thank you. Sławomir, you are director of the Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue and Understanding. Who is calling?
Putin.
2009-2010, it was time of reset, modernization agenda, big hopes, also and actually in this region. I remember that after the cutting was recognized, admitted by Russia, some of Latvian politicians said, you know, that the recognition of Latvia's and Baltic occupation is not behind the mountains. Russia will follow also admitting it. Again, 2014, is any dialogue and understanding left actually now?
Well, it is a not unexpected question, as you can imagine. Yes, before I give you my answer to that, I think that it is important to explain to the audience also what kind of institution I represent. The Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue and Understanding was created by the Act of Parliament in 2011. And it was an outcome of the work of Group for Difficult Matters, which was established in 2008, and it has been chaired under, it's chaired by Professor Adam Daniel Rotfeld, the Polish former foreign minister, and Anatoly Torkunov from the Russian side. And in 2009, they sent a letter with recommendations to both governments that in order to enhance the communication between societies, we need additional specific institution to provide support and provide appropriate facilitation for this communication. And as you can imagine, in present circumstances, I'm frequently being asked whether we still have somebody to talk to on the Russian side, whether there is reason to maintain and carry out dialogue, and what we can understand more out of the Russians' moves in international relations. And first, I have to say that if you asked me the question whether there is a chance for dialogue, I could respond politically, saying that as long as I do have support in Polish Parliament, and I do have support in Polish Parliament, I mean, majority is behind me. So that's the most simple answer I can give you. But of course, I have to talk to people behind myself. I mean, the Polish Parliament, in the Polish government, And I have to deliver the message that we should maintain our instruments to communicate not only with the Russian authorities, but first and maybe foremost with the Russian society. Yes, for 25 years, we lived, in the West, in the belief that owing to the political and economic integration founded on democratic values, rule of law and free market, Europe had finally overcome its non-democratic legacy. This new political Europe, with its inclusiveness as an important magnet, kept the door open to those European societies who cast off authoritarian traditions and expressed readiness to build shared European welfare and security through integration. And democratic order is something which would prevail forever. Now, I think we have to change this this way of thinking a little bit and adjust to the reality we are facing. Russia's aggressions against Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, attempts to throw Ukraine into chaos, and entire propaganda campaign unleashed by the Kremlin to cover the violation of fundamental norms of international law, all brought us to the completely new circumstances. So if we do have a problem with Russia today, or with Putin, we have the problem with violation of norms of the procedure, not necessarily, with Putin's claims or arguments related to, well, say, Russian-speaking population in Ukraine. We have had new instruments to deal with such questions if, the rights of this population were somehow violated by the Ukrainians, but they didn't. But if we did have an instrument, but Putin decided to go unilaterally and violated international law and make the case for himself, justifying military intervention. The world has broadly condemned the Russian aggressions. The US and the EU imposed sanctions, and I would defend the sanctions as an instrument, because we have to bear in mind the sanctions played let's say, three roles. One, of course, through the sanctions we condemn Putin. Yeah, that's clear. Second, also important role, we show support to the Ukrainians. And third, we harmonize the West. Harmonize the reaction of the United States, Canada, and Europe towards this reality we are facing. It is also very important too for ourselves, because probably it's the only instrument. We have something to talk about, how to collectively respond to Putin, to bring us together and keep us together. But I would like to turn your attention into not widely discussed danger which come out of Putin and Crimea affair. I mean that at stake is the future of democracy in Europe. That's the point I would like to make. First, with Russian aggression against Ukraine meeting no firm tough reaction, it may turn out that some European politicians will find Putin's approach to politics attractive. The Russian elites are already seeking to build political alliances with Europe's radical, even Russian right, And in the future, they may be looking for supporters also among the European mainstream, invoking tempting arguments of short-term economic gains. Second argument I would like to use to support my point, unless the democratic world shows determination in jointly treating the threat of aggressive authoritarianism, some European societies, especially in countries bordering to Putin's Russia, may conclude that in order to defend themselves against the aggressive Russia, they have to abandon democratic values or follow Putin's lead in invoking the marker forces of nationalism. That's one of the additional reasons why we should stay together in shaping common response to the threat coming from Putin's Russia today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sławomir. Thank you, and I think you've been doing a great job in engaging, and I think it has been always important to keep the channels of the dialogue and discussion open. It also hits me to some extent paradoxically that after more than 20 years of collapse of communism and living in as what Thomas Friedman would say, in a flat world, we still have to use Kremlinology to some extent, try to understand what's exactly on the mindset of Mr. Putin, what's exactly in the Kremlin, who makes decisions, what kind of decisions. And that's why I would like to ask you to give us some probably insights from your perspective, because you said that there is Polish parliament behind. Still, Polish parliament is behind the centers, that it's necessary. That it's still necessary, even though you admit and recognize that sanctions are important, it's still necessary to have a dialogue. Do you have the feeling that there is a Russian parliament or Russian political elite behind the same framework? Or it's evaporated in recent months? What's your feeling in this regard? Is it mutual?
Well, that's a very good question, because the agreement was that similar institution would appear on each side. I mean, the Polish parliament created my center, and Russian center was also created in Moscow by the act of Russian president. So yes, this center is it's under operation. Usually they are focused on supporting different cultural events, and that's okay. We are trying to facilitate people-to-people contact, and each year we offer the programs allowing approximately 1,000 young people from both sides to meet together and to do something together, because it's not the idea is not about tourism. The idea is working together and trying to solve common agenda, common problem. And I think it is crucial. I think that maybe even more than in other times. We should avoid an increased anti-Russian sentiments in the West. And a clear message must be issued to the effect that the democratic world's enemy is neither Russia nor the Russians, but very particular policy of Putin. That's our red line. We have to address to the Russian society with the message of goodwill. By the way, that's only one remark. I was engaged in advocacy, in political advocacy in the eve of Vilnius summit. I try to encourage politicians to do something more than just usual statement, a bureaucratic statement issued by European Commission, what has been just agreed behind the closed doors in Vilnius. My argument was that Europe, should address to the population of Eastern Europe, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, with the message that we are open also, Europe is open also for them. that we could build something together, that, and we should address our message beyond the heads of the governments of respective Eastern European countries.
Sławomir, thank you very much. Of course, I would very much hope also that Putin would use the same language what you just used, that good dialogue and engagement is exactly the way forward, and sometimes we perhaps not see it directly at least, but anyway, let's hope that it comes. Sam, U.S., of course, we know that it's a little bit over-trivialized and oversimplified, this U.S. pivoting to Asia. Is the silver lining now that actually the Ukrainian crisis has brought U.S. back to Europe? And it's again, the tanks we've been sort of being concerned that they are rolling away and that military presence is sort of decreasing, that actually now the U.S. has the political will to reassure its partners, and we really highly appreciate it. So is U.S. and Obama again back fully to Europe, or it's a temporary switch?
Thank you, Andris, for the question, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today and for the invitation to Riga. It's great to be here. I think the reassurance plank of the U.S. government's response to the crisis has been very significant and very real. It has involved an unprecedented deployments in the NATO allies in Eastern and Central Europe that have not seen that kind of physical U.S. presence since they became members of the alliance, in some cases over a decade ago. So I think it shouldn't be underestimated. At the same time, it's very unlikely that the crisis in Ukraine will undo what is now called the U.S. rebalancing to the Asia-Pacific. I think that there is a consensus in Washington that rebalancing to the Asia-Pacific more broadly is this priority for the 21st century, and that while you will see more reassurance missions than perhaps ever in the past, and that might result in something permanent. I don't know so far. That the rebalancing is a fact, and it's not going to go anywhere. I think, though, that it's important to note that, in my view, that's not the end of the world, in part because NATO allies, although they have every right to be apprehensive and to seek reassurance in the context of the crisis in Ukraine and Russia's actions, that the Ukraine crisis in itself, in terms of direct implications and direct threats for Eastern and Central European allies, don't have as much to worry about as the rest of Ukraine does. And I think that has to do, my reading at least, of Russia's motives in Ukraine is how I reached that conclusion. I don't think this was about protecting ethnic Russians. I don't think it was about the world order. I don't think it was about domestic legitimacy, and I don't think it was about Kosovo or the invasion of Iraq or anything like that. I think it was very much about Russian interests in Ukraine and the way in which the change of power occurred on the evening of February 21st was viewed as a threat to those interests, and I'll get a little bit into that. We know that after hours after signing the agreement that was brokered by 3 European foreign ministers, a representative of Russia, between the then president and the then opposition, that the government of Viktor Yanukovych basically disintegrated under him. In fact, it happened so precipitously that protesters in central Kiev thought that it was a trap because the government buildings that had been protected by phalanxes of riot police for weeks suddenly were unguarded, and they thought they were being lured in. But it turned out that wasn't the case, and Yanukovych fled. The parliament, in a somewhat extra-legal situation, relieved him of his duties and appointed a new government. That's not how it was seen in Moscow, and it's really important to understand what motivated subsequent Russian actions to understand how I think it was perceived there. And I think the way it was perceived there was as a coup, installing a government deeply hostile to Russian interests, supported by the very same Western governments that had just signed the agreement the day before and suddenly forgotten about it. There was a fear that this new government could move rapidly towards the EU and NATO, undo the Kharkiv agreements that extended the Black Sea Fleet basing agreement, and so on. In short, the prospect of a sort of nightmare epic fail of Russia's Ukraine policy, which among all the priorities in Russian foreign policy has always been uniquely seen as important. To clarify, that's not how I view those events, but I think that's how many in Moscow saw them. And I think at that point, Putin and those around him seemed to conclude that all the levers available to them in pursuit of their policy had failed within recent weeks, other than military intervention. In the previous 6-8 weeks, they had tried 3 other major tools in Russian diplomacy: threatening a trade war, throwing $15 billion at the problem, and cutting a deal with the West, as in on February 21st. And none seemed to accomplish anything. So, in an act of desperation, and I would really argue that it was not an act of strength, but an act of desperation, he ordered this brazen invasion. And my point here is that the invasion was mostly not about Crimea. It was about Russian interests in Ukraine. And, you know, I think, therefore, we don't even know for sure at this point whether they intended to annex when they ordered the invasion. I think it's clear, though, that the invasion foreclosed other options. In short, it's pretty clear to me, at least, that it was not a land grab for land grab's sake, or an imperialist project, or something to do with the Eurasian Union, compatriots, Kosovo, etc. It was about Russia's interests in Ukraine as the leadership perceived it, and a threat to them that they saw materializing. Now, that makes me quite nervous about Ukraine's future, in the sense that it was clear that Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, didn't accomplish very much as far as the agenda that had spurred the invasion. So the fact that we're now seeing what we're seeing in southeastern Ukraine is not at all surprising in that context. However, why I think the rest of Europe need not worry as much, certainly, as the rest of Ukraine, about Russian tanks rolling across borders, or their borders, I should say, is that these circumstances that I described cannot be repeated easily in other places. As I mentioned, Ukraine was always uniquely important in Russian foreign policy, and always uniquely vulnerable with a major base on its soil. And Russia does, in fact, understand the difference between NATO and non-NATO Europe. Arguably, that's why they resisted Ukrainian membership in NATO so hard. So I think that at the end of the day, there's a very understandable reason why the reassurance mission has been undertaken, and it's eminently justified by a very different threat picture. But I think that the direct threat to NATO allies as a result of, from what we now have seen of Russian actions in the last 6 to 8 weeks, is perhaps not as great as some might claim.
Thank you, Sim. Thanks for reassuring us on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, I have immediate, in a sense, question. You provoked me to some extent, the question. Isn't it a bit asymmetric if Russia perceives that the conditions of agreement are not being kept by either side? You just take the territory, you annex the territory?
Totally. And nothing of what I said, by the way, should justify, is meant as a justification at all. I do think, however, it's important to understand the perspective of those who took the decisions that played out. It was completely egregious and a violation of, every imaginable international norm and several agreements that Russia has signed up to directly regarding Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, particularly in the context of its nuclear disarmament. But my point is that I think it was a decision taken when a conclusion was reached that nothing else worked, and that this was the only thing that they had remaining to try. If I were advising Putin at that moment on February 21st, I would have said, just wait. Give it a month. They'll be back on their knees, no matter what they're telling you now, because of the economic dependency that does exist. But, he didn't seek out my advice. So,
But Sam, if you follow the same logic, so isn't it that Putin can say, but we have also some interests in Transnistria in Moldova, in Nagorno-Karabakh in Armenia, in Ossetia and in Georgia, or in some parts of the Baltic states, and but we think that the conditions of, let's say, our interests, or the major trust of our interest is not being complied with. on it being taken into account.
So I think
basically Ukraine might not be unique in this regard.
So what makes, I think you're certainly right that the risk of that Russia has demonstrated that it's willing to do things that we had assumed that they weren't willing to do, right? And therefore the modus operandi of Russian diplomacy, so to speak, if that's what one can call it, Russian foreign policy, clearly is different than many assumed that it was before this crisis. And therefore that does clearly present risks that or contingencies that need to be taken into account in the defense of our NATO allies and not just our NATO allies. But the question really is about the difference fundamentally is how unique Ukraine was in terms of its vulnerability and its importance to Russia and how it was perceived that way. And therefore the lengths that Russia is willing to go to preserve its interest as it sees it. Now, that having been said, I don't think that I do think that Russia, that the leadership understands the difference between NATO Europe and non-NATO Europe, and that's another reason why I think that there is a difference in the context of NATO allies. Now, that's not the same in other parts of the neighborhood where countries are not members of NATO, and therefore, I do think that it's understandably that Mr. Lukashenko and Mr. Nazarbayev are quite nervous these days.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And I think this is also the appropriate time. Sorry to the audience for a while. I would like to bring in Eka Tekeshalashvili. Sorry to pronounce. I know. So the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and the former Vice Prime Minister, as I remember correctly. I think that the Georgia, I mix the countries and the surnames. So, what would you say? Is it unique? Is it some risks still? How do you perceive the risks which are emanating from Ukraine, also with regard to Georgia? Because, we speak of Ukrainian crisis as unique in 2014, but there was 2008 as well. What's your vision?
Well, thank you. I'll try to stand here so that I could actually approach the audience too in that way. To me, even the title of the event is a bit puzzling when we speak about the continuum of the dynamics from the Russian side. Why what happens now? And then the questions that we ask now are asked now, basically. And the waters seem to be uncharted now, when the Russian side has been very clear in terms of the policy development for years already. We've just have been very unattentive, I guess, and I generalize that, but I guess in Georgia we've been very attentive to that, about the vision that Putin has developed. And then the famous Munich speech is, I guess, a very good indication where Russia was moving. And then if we look back and then have that in mind while looking forward, we have to have more of a clarity of what we face right now. And then when we speak about revisionist Russia in that sense, we have to have a clarity of the view, what we mean by that. And then by revisionist, there are different elements, obviously, into that. But then one of the main ones that seems to me is the main one in that sense is that Russia wants to force transatlantic community to accept Russia as the new Soviet Union, basically. And then to have business as usual with Russia in the way that Russia is entitled to the near-abroad field of interest, or privileged field of interest in the way how Russia calls it in different ways, but then countries surrounding Russia that have limited sovereignty, that are not only dependent on Russia, but in real essence have limited sovereignty, that they don't decide themselves what their current times or what their futures are. And then the West accepting that as a reality that is unavoidable reality, and then to have business with Russia, with that type of Russia. And then the test grounds for that have been conducted very, very systemically by Russia. And obviously 2008 in that sense already was a game changer, to which the reaction that Russia got from the West was emboldening reaction to Russia. Because basically Russia understood that you can invade the neighboring country, you can continuously occupy 20% of that country. You can put openly, without any disguise, 10,000 troops in the tiny country like Georgia is, build up the militaries, put Iskanders in both of these two small regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazian regions. And none of that became reason sine qua non condition, basically, reversal of that, basically, for continuation of strategic partnership with Russia on many issues. So basically, in a very short period of time, Russia understood that everybody went to business as usual with Russia. Even more of that, all reset policy and everything has been developed after that. And Russia obviously put that into the calculus. Russia used very effectively time in terms of learning the lesson of military imperfection of its action in Georgia, so that we've seen that Russia is much more prepared now of having much well-organized and then capable forces to be used on the ground. And then the resources that Russia has used, by the way, after 2008, then went to unencountered pockets of the Russian officials, but really were used for the modernization of those parts of the Russian army. So those years were very successfully used by Russia in that sense. And in the meantime, we haven't seen that any clarity of that has ever been analyzed properly in a conceptual type of the way in the West. So to me, the surprise is that Ukraine became a surprise to some degree, why it all developed. My disagreement with an argument about reaction of Putin to the events in Ukraine after the February agreement is that the way how Crimea has been executed indicates that it was very well pre-planned. It doesn't mean that Putin was necessarily looking for that opportunity or it was the best scenario for him, but it means that he was very well prepared for that. So everything worked like clock in Crimea, and then it continues to work pretty well for Russia now in east and southeast of Ukraine as well. Which means that propaganda part of it, cyber attacks part of it, military units that were used to, I mean, you can't have that without preparation. So Putin spent time preparing, and then by that maintaining an upper hand, which means that he acts proactively, we act reactively to that. And I'm coming to my main point. I mean, there has been a lot of arguments about Russia, what we need to do in terms of sanctions, and then the rest of it. I'd like to bring perspective from non-member country, aspiring country to be a member of NATO, deep down in our hearts to be part of the EU as well. Nobody ever encouraged, obviously, us to become, but I don't speak about the countries who always did, but then in general, a sense of that. The main mistake to me that for many years has been continuing element of the Western policy was that to stop with the enlargement and the way it stopped, and for the reasons that it stopped. It was not only enlargement fatigue, it was not only economics. One of the reasons, not the only, I acknowledge that, was that not to irritate Russia. Because at that time, Russia became stronger, Russia saw its policies, and then the West basically said that, okay, what we're going to do is that it's the neighborhood. We don't want that neighborhood maybe to be part of our family anyways. They are too weird for that, too post-Soviet perhaps. So let's have that as a common neighborhood. We'll share with Russia. We'll persuade Russia that we can share a neighborhood, we are good partners, and we have strategic relationships. So let's fix Russia first, relationship with Russia first, and then the neighborhood. And I'll stop in a minute. I understand the time is limited. And that has been a very big mistake, because what that allowed Russia to have as a terrain for activity is to influence all of those countries and impede their transformation, democratic development. Some countries were exemplary to that, and then Georgia is one of that, but we suffer too much for that as well. We are dismembered currently de facto because of our strife and actual activities in terms of transformation. So my appeal in this current situation is that don't be restricted in terms of thinking what one can do directly with Russia. Be very bold, robust, and ambitious on what you can do with the countries that aspire to be part of the transatlantic family. Maybe not right away the members, but then help us out to sustain the challenge that we have right now from Russia. Because if Russia is more and more encircled by democracies around, sustaining democracies, secure democracies that can sustain their sovereignty to begin with, there are much better chances for Russia itself to become a normal country. And Ukraine is existential for that, but then not only Ukraine, especially for the energy security-related issues from Europe when we speak about Caspian Sea Basin, and then Georgia being an essential bottleneck to that. And this is a doable task. You will have a lot of eagerness to be fighting together with you, with the countries that are already have proven to be being partners in many other terrains as well, including in Afghanistan. And I speak obviously here on behalf of Georgia. We are ready to sacrifice more than we've sacrificed. But then obviously if an unfortunate decision now will be that part of accommodation could be that let's entrench with our borders, have a bit of a novel Cold War, and then by that we would be doomed to be on the other side of the Iron Curtain. That will be much longer, much more painful confrontation for the West, ultimately with an emboldened Russia, reincarnated Soviet Union, rather than taking an action now and making us more secure and sustainable. And then the summit in NATO, it should be about the common defense, but then it should be about the aspirant countries as well, I believe. And then security arrangements of the type that can make ourselves more defendable in that sense.
Okay, thank you very much for this powerful Georgian perspective. I think it was excellent contribution to the, I think also very excellent and insightful panel. Now the floor is open. We have half an hour already. First hands are raising. Please introduce yourself, and if you have a particular person, speaker to address, please also name it. Karina is here, and I promised ladies first. So excuse me. So and then you are.
Yes, hello. My name is Karin Peterson. I'm head of Latvian Institute. It's another one. So, first of all, I'm impressed by what you learned people said, and especially by what Mr. Ex-Minister said, and I would like to start with what you concluded with. I was very much impressed by the idea that a secure, sustainable, and sovereign near neighborhood for Russia is the hope for the democratization of Russia itself. And therefore, I would like to revert to what you, Sir, Mr. Ian Kearns, started. Your first sentence was that Putin is now using all instruments available to him to stop his near neighborhood become hostile to Russia. I would like to ask you, don't you think that if there was any hostility, because we are also a neighborhood, we were not at all hostile, so if there was any hostility, has he not increased the hostility by using all the instruments available? And do you share his idea that if a country joins NATO, do you share Putin's idea that if a country joins European Union or NATO, that it by default becomes hostile to Russia? And sorry if I have misunderstood you.
Okay, thank you. Let's take a round of questions, please. Ojars.
Thank you. Ojars Kalniņš, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Latvian Parliament. I was intrigued by something that Sławomir said about the radical right in Europe possibly sympathizing with Putin. We know that there's an American who was a formerly fervid anti-communist by the name of Pat Buchanan, who has praised Putin for supporting traditional family values, for his position on gay rights, and some other, let's say, Tea Party type positions. I'm not aware of anybody else in the Tea Party or in the U.S. who has shared these views. On the other hand, we know that Russia, in its rhetoric, talks a great deal about the rise of neo-Nazism and fascism in Europe, yet it has its own neo-Nazi type, fascist type movement of nationalists. And so I'm just curious about this potential rise of the radical right. During the Cold War, it was the radical left that sympathized with Moscow. You're suggesting now that the radical right in Europe could go that route. And so my question is, are there any Pat Buchanans in Europe that are starting to surface?
Okay, thank you. Janis?
Who else?
Thank you very much. Janis Kajaciņš. I'm an advisor to the Latvian MOD and MFA. My question is about Russia's attitude to the United States and this schizophrenia. On the one hand, the United States is so weak, frightened, capable of drawing a red line somewhere, but then not being able to recognize it, and therefore cannot stand up to Putin. On the other hand, it is so powerful that it is pulling all the strings in Kiev, has complete control over everything that's going on there, and the CIA is even responsible for the internet. Which version is true?
It's a question to the Russian participant or to the American participant?
I think both.
Okay, so we have the full panel of questions and answers. Please, let's go through in this case. So the first one was to Ian.
Thank you. Well, no, I made the comment that I thought he was using all instruments available to him to stop his near abroad, in his terms, becoming hostile to his definition of Russian interests. Of course, I don't believe that membership of NATO or the European Union is inherently hostile to anybody, but I don't believe that's the way he sees it. I agree with what the points that Sam made with regard to that. But so you know, that's how I would answer your question. But I also just wanted to pick up this theme of the bold strategy for for the Eastern Partnership countries. I mean, I know this is a very sensitive issue, the whole issue of how much support is given, whether the EU is going to enlarge, whether NATO is offering enlargement, and so on. I said in my comments that I thought, you know, I recognise the right of countries in this region to ask for membership of these institutions. My point is, I don't believe that the existing members of these institutions are going to offer that membership. And I do think it's partly about economics. I think when you have member countries in the European Union that have unemployment rates of 25-30%, youth unemployments of 50%, still going through deep austerity measures in terms of public sector budgets, that there's a very limited appetite for the costs of enlargement. Now, I also think there's no consensus in NATO for further enlargement. Now, what's significant about that, I think, is that if we try a bold strategy and then we don't deliver, I think that's worse than not attempting the bold strategy, frankly, because I think what that will do is it will draw a bigger response from Russia. It will deepen the confrontation in the Eastern Partnership countries, which will be incredibly bad for them. And in the end, I don't think we'll have the outcome we want, because I don't believe that policymakers in the UK, in London, Berlin, Paris, Madrid, elsewhere, are going to deliver for these countries. I think part of our strategic response to this has to be some awareness of the limits of our own power. And it's not that we don't have the power to do something, but part of our own power is what can we deliver in a politically viable way. You know, you can have all the policy instruments in the world at your disposal, but if you can't mobilise them in a politically viable way, they don't exist effectively. And I think we've got to be very careful about not overreaching our response and then failing to deliver. I think we can make the problem worse if we do that.
Thank you. Sławomir.
Well, as I said, even now we can see Speaker of Russian Foreign Affairs Committee meeting with Mrs. Le Pen. Even now, even today, we can see members of far-right Hungarian party supporting Russia in Council of Europe. But I mean something different. I mean that one day this kind of eventual Putin success may encourage European mainstream politicians to start to think in terms of regaining sovereignty, the term which has been already used by Putin, or strengthening the sovereignty. Putin is very good in playing with words, so and twisting the meaning of the words. So one day, European mainstream may turn into power politics in that sense, and that's the threat I see, and that's the threat I would encourage all democratic community to face and to use as an argument, one of the important arguments, why we should stay together, why we should shape a common response to this particular threat.
Thank you. Sergey?
On the attitude to the US, I think you should not really be surprised when you see a paradox between various theses that you find in the midst of this information war. And you should not go too far in analyzing those theses that you see in the course of this information war. When it comes to the real attitude to the US, I think the understanding is still that the US is something that Russia would love to be, the superpower. And if the US can do something, why cannot we? If the US has a strong group of allies who support them on every issue, why cannot we build a similar group of allies? Why cannot we violate some international norms if the US violated some international norms in other cases? So it's a kind of an alter ego, and of course people think about what the US does, what happens in the US, and even if we just try to stop all kind of relationships because of the sanctions, even in this case, I think people will still think of the US as a kind of a role model and try to replicate at least some parts of the US experience. Actually, one more thing on this. You probably noticed that there is quite some significant open expression of patriotism, which is characteristic for the US. And as this is something that does not naturally grow it's not naturally growing in Russia. There are probably ideas on how we can sort of stimulate this, how we can electrify people to the extent that they go out to the streets with the flags, shout the national anthem, and the rest. So the US experience is something people look at closely, but sometimes analyze it in the wrong way. If you take the official policies, it happens quite often that it is analyzed in the wrong way. And one more point on this alleged spillover effect of democracy. The democratic countries around Russia are sort of helping democracy to develop in Russia. I've heard about it many times. I don't believe it. You can easily have all the countries around Russia being mature democracies and still have troubles on this issue in Russia. You can have it. You can have it vice versa. You can have some democratic development in Russia and still some countries close to Russia experiencing difficulties with completing this transformation process. So I don't think these things are dependent on each other, and if the democratic process in Russia goes forward, it will happen because the Russian population develops its understanding of things, its understanding of what kind of the state it wants. So it's much more about internal processes than any kind of foreign policy development and development in adjacent countries.
Thank you, Sergey. Sam.
I'm going to echo some of the things that Sergey just said, I suppose. But I think the attitude is schizophrenic. There was a joke that U.S. diplomat in Moscow once made to me that said, the cure for American declinists would be a trip to Moscow, because you'll hear that suddenly the U.S. is behind everything that's happening in the world everywhere. And so there's, on the one hand, this sort of idea that the U.S. is omnipresent, omnipowerful, and, as Sergey mentioned, the gold standard by which any institution or development is judged in Russia. Certainly the military, for example, it's constantly about measuring up to the U.S. But at the same time, it's not exactly, I haven't heard this line about U.S. weakness, but more that denouncing the U.S. at the same time as secretly sort of wanting to be at that level, or not so secretly, often openly. I fully agree with Sergey, or partially, I guess, about this role of regime type in the neighborhood, so to speak, and its influence on Russia. There is zero evidence to suggest that there is a positive causal arrow between democratization among Russia's neighbors and positive political change within Russia. In fact, you can make a coherent case that the Orange Revolution in Ukraine actually was consistent with, if not causal of, a bunch of really bad things that happened in Russia domestically in the following years. And, I don't think that regime type is really what motivates Russian policy vis-a-vis its neighbors. If you ask Norway or Finland, for example, I don't know that they've received much pressure on the nature of their political system. But I do think that if there is a causal arrow that does exist in here, I might disagree with Sergey a little bit, it is from Russia outwards, particularly in Central Asia, but also in countries like Armenia, Azerbaijan, where there still is the sense of the former imperial metropole and that norms of behavior that are acceptable there. Well, if he can do it, so can I. But at the end of the day, I think Sergey is right that these processes are fundamentally domestically driven, and that international influence is at best, marginal in affecting political processes within transition countries.
Thank you. So we still have time for one last round. Yes, Attis, Irina, please. Let's start. Please introduce yourself.
Attis Lēņš, Latvian Saima. I was at Leonard Meri conference, and I was struck by one statement. Francis Heusberg, whom you know, very famous analyst, went to Moscow 2 weeks ago with a group of analysts and talked to the pro-Putin camp and to the anti-Putin camp. And the pro-Putin camp said, well, we were pleasantly surprised that in the Crimea, the the Ukrainian soldiers did not shoot at our special forces. The little green men. It was very nice. On the other hand, the Ukrainians cannot be seriozny ljudi. You know what that means? Not serious people. And this paved the way for contempt and going into South and East Ukraine because they're not serious. We can do what we like. And did the West tell Ukraine not to shoot back? Huh?
Everybody, please. Irina, please.
Irina Kuznetsova, Associate Fellow of the Institute. My question will go to Sergey. Sergey, thinking long term, should we start be worrying about northern Kazakhstan? Recently, speaking about eastern Ukraine, Putin mentioned Novorossiya, and as far as I remember, Kazakhstan was just an autonomy within the Soviet Union until 1936. And by some, this region is regarding northern Kazakhstan as southern Siberia. Are there any sophisticated plans being elaborated currently in Kremlin about the creation of Среднеазиатский федеративный округ? I mean, thinking long term, because now it's trendy to speak about Russian mir, Russian word, Ruski mir, and I would like to hear your opinion about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Still some last chances for yes, please. I mean, yes, you are absolutely the equal.
To abuse the microphone.
No, you have to abuse it. Please do it.
Okay. I was sort of surprised when I heard that Crimea, at least appeared so, that Crimea is a lost cause. Like, let's accept it. Like, I heard from somebody from the panel that appeared, maybe I'm mistaken in your opinions, that Crimea is a lost cause. And I would also agree that if we allow Russia to act this way, it started with Georgia and continues now, I'm also concerned that it gives the precedent for further action. So my question would be, how can you form a dialogue with a party with Putin who is not a dialogue maker? He's more a doer rather than a talker. So yeah, that would be my question to the panel.
Just introduce yourself.
Alina, a student at Riga University.
Great, thanks. Some other questions? One sentence.
About neighboring countries' example and the power of that we are part of the Soviet Union, because that makes difference. In Russia, nobody asks the question why in Norway nobody takes bribes. They started to ask question why in Georgia nobody started to take bribes. So that's here you are about the power of example, and then how democracies make difference in the surrounding areas for Russia.
Okay, yeah. Please.
Axel Stuklers, student of Latvian University. I'd like to ask, I'm surprised by, when analyzing all this situation, by all the attention going to the crisis management, and in my view, there's very little attention given to how this situation came about, that Russia could act like it did. And could it be that Russia met so little resistance, maybe from the global community, that because of it has become kind of cliche to criticize U.S. policy in the Middle East, for example, and so on. But has the West lost its moral high ground to say, like, don't do it? That's my question.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, please, over there. Let's take the...
In terms of Ukrainian crisis, it seems that...
Please introduce yourself.
Andrei Rebel of Moscow. Today is Sustainable Development Institute. So it seems that technically Putin puts oil in existing fire in Ukraine. It's not like he entering country which was absolutely peaceful and nice before. Maybe it's more effective not to try to fight with Putin, but now force Ukrainian government to somehow solve the crisis inside. That Russian oil would be just ineffective in absence of fire inside the Ukraine.
Okay, yes, thank you. If not, so for the final replies, final comments, please. No? Yes? Ian, you've been ready also to take one of the first questions immediately. So
okay, thank you. On this question of the Ukrainians aren't serious, and did the West tell them not to attack or to shoot back and so on. I'm sure the West did urge a lot of restraint. I think they did that because they thought it might trigger a Russian invasion. I think they still think that. But, however, I also think the situation is more complicated than that. And I think that analysis kind of suggests that there is a government in Kiev which could be in control of the whole country if it wanted to be, and which would have the loyalty of most of the population in the country if it just chose to take action. My questions would be, well, why didn't the police do anything when these buildings were being occupied? Why has there been no local law enforcement reaction? Why has there been no reaction from local civic leaders to organise that and to stimulate that? Why have there not been very large demonstrations of people on the streets against these occupations? Now, I don't know the answer to all these questions, quite frankly, but what I think is that Ukraine is a more divided country than many people in the West want to believe. And I think it was quite interesting to me the way when the first attempt by the Ukrainian authorities to launch their counter-terrorism operation, as they described it, the days in which they quickly lost those 5 armoured personnel carriers, and they were surrounded by villagers, old women and others saying, don't do this, we don't want you here, don't come. It just didn't fit the Western narrative very well. I mean, the Western narrative on this effectively portrayed this as, they ought to have been welcomed as liberating soldiers exerting the authority of the government in Kiev, and that's not what happened. And it tells me that Ukraine is a more divided country than we in the West think. And I think that is very relevant for policy for us, because I think if we drive the Ukrainian government to take this kind of action, they will lose a portion of their country. Absolutely, for sure. That's my analysis of that. And I don't think that's a good outcome for them, and I don't think we should put them into that situation. Just on one other of these, I won't try and do them all. I know we haven't got much time. Yeah, I think it's clear to me that what we do in response to what Russia has done is important to what happens next. It's important to what Russia does next. I think there is an action-reaction cycle here. However, I don't think it just started. This action-reaction cycle has been going on ever since the end of the Cold War. And in that process, the Russians have to take a big share of the blame for why we've ended up in the situation we're in. But frankly, we have to too. We have pursued, we told the Russians for a long time that the notion of a common economic space between Lisbon and Vladivostok was simply a nonsense, an untenable idea, that the European Union and the Eurasian Union were fundamentally incompatible. 4 weeks after the Vilnius summit, we changed our minds and started a serious conversation with Russia on the theme of a common economic space, and that was supposed to be a big theme of the Riga summit next year for the European Union. Now, it either was fundamentally incompatible, and that's the end of it, or it wasn't fundamentally incompatible. It can't have been fundamentally incompatible one day and the next day it wasn't. We made mistakes. We positioned this as an either-or challenge. Western politicians talked about the need for Ukraine to make a civilizational choice. Those aren't my words. Those are the words of some Western politicians in significant positions of influence. Ukraine had to make a civilizational choice. Well, and there are people in Russia who are building a kind of Eurasian ideology to define Russia as something separate from Europe, what a wonderful gift it is to them for European politicians to say, yes, you've got a civilizational choice. You can either be with us in Europe or you can be with the Russians. By implication, arguing ourselves that the Russians aren't European. We've made big mistakes in the action-reaction cycle, and I think one of the things we have to do in this crisis, whatever we do, whatever steps we take, the main question which we haven't been asking for the last few years in our diplomacy is, what will the Russians do in return? How is this going to look from Moscow's perspective? We might think Moscow has a warped perspective. How is this going to look from Moscow's perspective, and how are they going to react? And is that the reaction we want, or can we do something different that might get a better response? I'll stop there.
Yes, thank you, Ian. Thanks. Sergey.
On the absence of response of the Ukrainian forces in Crimea, I joined this stand that this could actually be treated as a provocation and lead the situation to an even worse situation eventually. It's very hard to speculate what kind of scenarios we could have had when we also the certain development on the ground, and we attempted to find a better solution than the one that was found. But I think at least to just to keep people alive was the most important goal, a goal which was much more important than achieving any political goals that you can imagine. And this was mostly accomplished. So it doesn't really play the central role to find out whether it was the West who inspired this behavior or it was the reasoning of Ukrainian politicians. But the thing that there was no open conflict in Crimea, I think, is rather a good thing than a bad thing. Because, and here I come to this question of Crimea being the lost cause. We all tend to speak about Crimea as a piece of land. We rarely speak about people who live there. People develop. There are new generations growing. We don't know at this point what new generations in Crimea will think of the Russian administration. Will they perceive this Russian government as their government? Will they have reservations about this? Will they have other ideas on how the land where they live can develop? No one knows how this can transform in several decades. But the important thing is just to simply keep these people alive. If you have a full-scale massacre in the area, this is something which is anyway worse than just keeping people alive under any political circumstances. And this is important to keep in mind as the crisis is still developing. On the northern Kazakhstan, we all saw those speculations in the press. You have an official answer from both the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov, and people from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that all this is nonsense. All this has nothing to do with Russian official policies. In the same time, you can find the hardcore conservatives in Russia who say, yeah, it's a kind of a greater Russia, and we should strive to get it back. But what's the most important, if you really think in the long term, what you can get as a result of this kind of policy being implemented, if someone really decides to go this way, will be a collapse of the Russian state. I'm pretty much sure about it. And this is why all reasonable politicians in Russia should oppose this kind of development, this kind of extrapolation of what we saw to all other areas. This will just lead to the collapse of the Russian state because it will change the structure of the population. It will be an unsurmountable, impossible burden on the Russian economy, and this will just end up with you having to deal not with a strong Russia like a superpower, but with a troubled country that needs external help just to survive. So I pretty much hope that this will not be the course taken by the Russian politicians. The last thing on the necessity to help Ukrainians to solve the internal crisis, yeah, I agree, but how to do this? And here we come to the issue of financial help, actually. We speculate so much about the necessity to support Ukrainian government, but in the situation when the Ukrainian government is very weak and unstable, the European Union, NATO countries, they are all hesitating. They are still hesitating to give any significant financial support. We speak currently about $1 billion or euros being pledged for the government. It's nothing in macroeconomic terms. So what is actually needed, desperately needed for Ukraine, is the program of economic development that would include the regions, that would include the adjacent transport routes that go to the European Union, that go to Russia. And we just find no time to think about this while we are in the midst of the crisis that consumes all of our attention. But the program of economic development for Ukraine is needed, and the international support for it will be necessary.
Okay. Thank you, Sergey.
It's still peanuts. But these figures for the IMF, 15 billion, etc. These are designed to get Ukraine through the next 6 to 12 months. This is going to require tens and tens of further billions. Where's the money coming from?
We can still discuss at the coffee. So let's proceed. Sławomir, please.
Just
to judge precisely what's
very briefly, I have to emphasize that I cannot agree with this action-reaction cycle proposed by Ian. I could, if we could, stick to the norms and procedures provided by international law. But let me describe the situation in February in the following way. President of Russia threw the table out of the window. If we'd like to play chess, first we have to put the chessboard on the table. And here is the problem. It leads me to the question concerning Crimea. Well, in realistic terms, we are not going to go for war about Crimea, and Ukrainians are not willing to do that. So that's the reality check. The second thing, as far as we are talking about norms and international law, we are not going to accept the way how this Crimean affair was carried out, and we are not going to accept Crimea as a part of Russian Federation. If you ask me how this process may look like in the future, I would tell you that probably the Crimea affair would be a subject of negotiations between Ukrainian government and Russian government, because it's up to Ukrainians to decide about their own territory at the end of the day. International community may support this process, encouraging both sides to sit behind one table. But we are not going to recognize Crimea as a part of Russian Federation as long as Ukrainian government is not willing to do either. About Crimea and which was not defended by Ukrainian troops. Well, of course, we are trying to encourage Ukrainian government not to go one step in the wrong direction. Ukrainian authorities are in very difficult position. Let me put it in this way. They have problems with controlling, exercising the control over their own institutions. So in that sense, I tend to agree with in this moment in Jan that they have to be very careful. On the other hand, of course, it is a democratic government, and this democratic government has to provide to its own public the message that they are capable to govern the state. And one thought more, if I may. There is a lesson for, all of us, all countries neighboring to Russia, that if you want international community to support you and provide some assistance, or be ready to engage into collective defense, you have to be ready to defend yourself first. And that's why you have to build your own capabilities to be ready to send the message that you are determined enough to defend your own country. Okay. Then international community may help you.
Thank you. Sam.
I just wanted to respond to this comment quickly about Crimea as a lost cause. I think it would be it's important to note that the sanctions, with the exception of the ones that were issued yesterday, were explicitly linked to Crimea. So those sanctions, which I'll get to why I think they're more significant than some of our other panelists have said, will remain as long as Russia's occupation of Crimea remains. So that is certainly not treating it as a lost cause. Now, I think it's important to note, even if the pace of the decision-making has been perhaps slower than some would have expected, that these sanctions are real and unprecedented. If you look at the net worth of somebody like Gennady Timchenko, it's something like 2 or 3 times the GDP of most countries that have been sanctioned in the past. So, I mean, we're not talking about insignificant financial actors who have, no assets that could be affected by this. This is serious business, and there just hasn't been sanctions at this level against an economy of any significant size ever before in the past. So, I think it's important to note that there is a degree to which we're entering that the actions that have been taken are quite serious and unprecedented. But most importantly, what they have done are the knock-on effects. Russia is a country that is very dependent on foreign capital, and the costs of borrowing have skyrocketed. We've seen more capital flight in the first quarter of this year than in the entirety of last year. Risk premiums on investment and investors' decision-makings, have skyrocketed as well. So this is not an insignificant impact, and it is, in fact, all attached to Crimea for the most part. Ian's question and the final question from the audience, I think, are linked about why the police didn't stop the buildings from being occupied. I mean, I think it's pretty clear we have an answer now that that surveys have been conducted in the east and south of Ukraine since the overthrow of Yanukovych, that 75% or 70% of the population in Donetsk and Lugansk believe this government to be illegal. So presumably 70% of the cops do too. Yeah, and so I think a solution to Ukraine's domestic political conflict has to be part of the overall solution to this crisis, or else it's not going to be a solution.
Excellent, Sam. Thank you. So I enjoyed the voices of agreement and especially disagreement from the audience. I think it just demonstrates that the contribution of this panel, to the widening and enriching also debate in Latvia and widening also the spectrum of arguments here in Latvia. And of course, we might disagree with some of things, but I think they really were very eloquently put forward as well. I think that just a couple of concluding remarks, and I think it also reflects what we've seen here, plurality of views. Plurality of views among us, but I think also plurality of views actually in the Euro-Atlantic Western community. And it's not just about balancing sanctions and at the same time instruments of dialogue with Russia, but actually balancing also the whatever different approaches within European Union and NATO itself. So, and I think actually this is the most difficult task in all of this. At the same time, of course, we should keep we would advocate that we should keep doors open and engage, at least try to engage also with Russia, but it doesn't preclude from saying what Slovak said. If your opponent is fainting, it doesn't mean that you can throw the table out or hit with the table your opponent. If the country is failing, it doesn't mean that you should just take territory of that country. And I mean, you can have different expectations, but absolutely it's asymmetric reaction and how it's difficult to engage with such partner. I think it also was mentioned in some of the questions and around the table that, and I would repeat it, it's also my theme, my favorite theme, what I like to repeat. It's also about our own homework, because exactly also the failing state, the failing institutions, the corruption of Ukraine also led to some extent to some things, at least some repercussions, implications. We cannot justify, let's say, Russia's action, but at the same time, it is also somehow interconnected. So that's why, of course, the homework, be it on a NATO level with reassurances, and we are happy US is reassuring and to some extent back to the region and also the regional interaction. But I think also domestic things, and it was said about divided societies, about corruption, about non-transparent things within the countries, about not legitimacy of those countries. I think these are important things what we should do if we want to be immune to outside risks, pressures and concerns. So with this, I am thanking many thanks to audience, but to have a very enriching and excellent and insightful panel for joining us and providing those views. And thank you very much, and please join me in a lot of applause.